Hi, hello, and welcome. I am definitely not Vlad, and you're watching the Mastering All Roles series, where we take a character of each role to 2K rating, earning the Keystone Master achievement. Please do note that I don't actually think I've mastered the role at this point, it's just a catchy title. Before we get started with the video, I have a question for you. Would you like to see me and my fiancée Danny attempt 0 to hero in a single weekend? Let me know in the comments. I won't be live commentating in this episode because, as I've discussed in episode 4, I kinda suck at preservation, so for the remaining 4 episodes, I'll be doing voiceovers after the fact. In this episode, I decided to improve my gear situation as much as possible. We did this by doing the Kill Ansarek quest, earning an enchanted rune crest. We also had one from reaching renown level 24 with severed threads. I crafted a cloak and neck using these 2 crests. Luckily, we also had some rune crests from the M+ runs we've done so far, so we turned 45 of those into yet another enchanted rune crest. With these 2, I crafted boots and a ring. Then I remembered there's also the Time Walking Weekly that awards a hero piece of gear from the current raid. So here's some live reaction to that loot. Alright, let's take a look-see here. We're gonna grab that, and we're just gonna Spy Master's fucking web, dude.
What?
Spy Master's fucking web.
No.
No. Woo! Now I just have to remember to use it, which I probably won't. She just did an excited twerk. I am actually recording me getting this look. She was like, when you're so happy you start twerking.
Me every day living with you.
Aw, it's so cute. On top of all that, we decked Aaron and I out with every single enchant possible, and in the end our setup looked something like this. I had a lovely +7 Mists key, and I was determined to get my revenge on the dungeon from the previous video by healing it comfortably. But the game had other plans for us. We were doing quite well for the most part, reaching the second boss with 0 deaths as expected, because up to the second boss this dungeon is a joke at these key levels. But at that point we had some issues with killing the clone. The issue was that we were completely ignoring the clone for the most part. Our teammates were chasing the boss, that the tank was kiting around the room. In the moment I was so confused by this that I verdant embraced directly into a line. I apologized, accepted the CR, and tried to use a raw Emerald Communion just to get a breather to decide what to do, which was to ping the ever-living crap out of the clone that was being ignored and die to the Fox hat. In our second attempt, and the tank did see the relentless pinging, but I messed up big time in my kiting of the fox and died to it. The warrior also died to standing in the orb line. After gobbling down another CR, I watched the entirety of our remaining party eat shit from a single foxy boy spawning between them. So I called for a reset when I saw that the tank was inspecting the floor. The third attempt at this went smoothly through the first intermission. A slight hiccup with a fox happened, but no one died. We asked our team to ignore the foxes and just kite them around instead, because they're all melee, so it'd be safer if they didn't try to get close to it to hit it. During the second intermission, the patty cake interrupt didn't go through, and our tank exploded. I typed to CR the tank, panic Emerald Communioned, and ate shit from a line. The worst thing is that I have the talent that lets me move while channeling it. But we'll chalk that mistake up to the panic of trying to figure out what to do after my tank takes a dirt nap, as Cussy Slayer would say. Needless to say, with 4 minutes and 40 seconds remaining, I decided to call it quits for that key. But I wasn't about to let one setback ruin my plans for vengeance against Mists of Terna Scythe, no siree. Danny wanted to run a key with me on her hunter, who just so happened to have a +7 Mists key, so here we go again. Other than a completely idiotic death on the first boss while typing and standing in a swirly, we reached the second boss without much incident, which also, much to my surprise, went completely without incident. The rogue did die to a line, but compared to the absolute shitshow we've been seeing on the other runs, this was amazing. I had a nice moment where I managed to set up the ultimate group heal in my opinion, which is a 5-man life bind into Emerald Communion. That felt really, really fun. One little thing I started doing with my temporal anomalies and the echoes they give was to not waste them, but rather use them for group-wide reversions. I've been told in comments that it's not great to use temporal anomaly into reversion for healing because it's not much healing and the procs aren't good, but honestly, I've been finding them quite useful and very potent as well. 50% extra healing on Chrono Flames is no joke, especially if paired with Lifebind, Call of Ysera, and Leaping Flames. It becomes a group-wide lay on hands. And considering that I only apply reversion if I have Echo on everyone and another temporal anomaly ready, I'm not wasting the group-wide Echo, quite the opposite. I'm making sure I make use of it before applying another one with my next temporal anomaly. With that ramble out of the way, we're at the last boss with roughly 13 minutes left and we're looking good. 2 deaths so far, Bloodlust ready, This'll be a blast. Except we instantly ate shit. The melee DPS decided to do the one thing I can't deal with, which is stand in Narnia. I repeat, the melee DPS decided to stand in Narnia. To be fair, I should have adapted to this and stood on top of the melee and tried to heal Danny as best I could, but so far in the dungeon, sticking to Danny and letting the melee do as they please was working pretty well. The issue was that we reached the intermission the same moment as Mind Link went out, so all the damage that the melee took from the intermission pulsing damage was amplified by Mind Link, so they just got wrecked. At this point, we really should have reset, and Danny called for it in voice comms, but my dumb ass ignored it and I didn't type it out to the group. We should have reset because the boss was at 70% when 2 of our DPS died, but we stuck to it for far too long and wasted a good chunk of time and a CR. The CR was sent out by the paladin right as the swirlies were dropping, so the warrior almost instantly died after accepting it, because they were standing in the no-no zones. We still didn't reset it at this point, wasting even more time. Once Danny died due to us being split up, I stood in shit and let myself die so that the tank possibly resets and we go again. On the way back, I was trying to tell people that I have a 30-yard range and if they run to the other side of the map, they will die. While typing this, I ran off a cliff like a moron, costing us a further 15 seconds. But even with the disastrous first pull of the boss, we still had a chance to pull this off as long as we killed it this time around. But the rogues seemed to misunderstand how Mind Link worked and thought they had to stay close to our tank, which ended up with them dying. Shortly after, our warrior ate shit in the intermission and we called for a reset. In the third attempt, we did finally kill the boss, but it was simply too little too late. I had an awesome 5-man lifebind, Emerald Communion for the first intermission. I also had a conniption watching our rogue friend run towards the tank to take more damage from Mind Link. The second intermission was a bit rougher. Our warrior friend took a lot of damage right before it started, so I had to spot heal and I got flustered, so I wasn't prepped for the incoming intermission damage. Our rogue friend dipped their toe into the poison zone twice and exploded because why wouldn't Blizzard add no-no zones that damage you the millisecond you look in their general direction? From then on, we didn't really have much left to do other than beat the shit out of the boss. Once it was dead, I rezzed the rogue and we went on to do the remaining trash. I did get a fractured spark for my trouble though, so that's nice, I guess. Danny decided to take a Sims break after this run, so I steeled myself for another pure pug key. I did some daily quests to get Valor Stones, useless currency, Blizzard please remove this crap, and got Harbinger of the Curved by upgrading our chest piece to 4 out of 8 champion. I applied to a bunch of +7 keys and got invited to a Siege of Borealis. For this key, I'll point out what to pay attention to in each pull, as well as the mistakes I did and what I could have done better in general. At the start of the key, the first pull is incredibly dangerous for the tank, so if you have an external or efficient spot healing, send it their way as they'll get multiple painful debuffs from the cutter enemies. The other thing to note is that bombers can and will wreck anyone who isn't full HP, so be ready to bounce back quickly from the AoE damage caused by the Enforcer's shout, which also interrupts as you can see from this clip, so mind your casting. On the second pull, you have a mob with a priority kick, the Wave Shaper's Watertight Shell. This puts an absorb shield on an enemy, which when broken, stuns everything near that enemy. You can also purge it. Both the Enforcer Shout and the Raider Yoink can be line of sighted, so make use of the nearby building to take cover from those. One dangerous overlap that can happen here, that can straight up wipe groups, is the Raider's Yoink happening as the Enforcer does his frontal, so it's important to keep track of the cooldowns of these abilities and making sure they're not synced up. The pull after this felt mostly accidental. The tank body pulled the larger group that most parties skipped while moving towards the smaller one, and then didn't use his death grips to group the ranged mobs with the rest of them. So I went to wing buffet the bomber onto the rest of the mobs. This also pushed the Wave Shaper away and no one was kicking it, so it didn't stack either while my kick was on cooldown. I believe our mage went down to a combination of the Enforcer Shout, Firebomb, and Brackish Bolt. In the kerfuffle, I just wasn't able to set up any healing beforehand. It didn't have a quick way to heal the mage before it was too late. If only there was a way to prevent casters from finishing their casts by using some kind of ability that is possibly off the global cooldown, or if there were spells in the game that reduce the incoming damage being taken. If only. The group we pull next has a patrol near it, which almost always ends up being a bit of a pain in the ass, because there are 2 bomber enemies, which just sit there and throw bombs and won't move. Luckily our DK found Death Grip in the spellbook and grouped up the bombers quite nicely. There was a moment where I nearly pulled the Enforcer standing on top of the gallows, but I got lucky for once and didn't. At this point we understand quite well the mobs that we faced so far, so we can fast forward to the first boss. Right off the bat, if you have any damage to send it into the Powder Shot NPCs. They're pretty squishy, but apart from them, there's basically no unavoidable damage in this boss fight. The mechanic for this boss fight is that ranged DPS kites him into bombs. At the start of the fight, there are no bombs, but they drop in shortly after. You can tell which of the circles will be a bomb by looking for the swirly part of it. If there is no swirly, it's a bomb. You saw me ping the location while the mage was kiting the boss. As a ranged healer, yes, believe it or not, the game considers evokers to be a ranged class, go figure, you have to pre-position on this boss in such a way that you can easily kite the boss into bombs. However, it's important to note that after the boss fixate runs out, or after he's no longer CC'd by the bomb, he will yoink everyone to him, doing moderate damage and starting an AoE cast that'll kill you if you stand close to him. Since this yoink negates any pre-positioning you could do, what you have to do is take note of where the next bomb is going to be if there is one available. That way you know which direction to run towards after you get yoinked in. In the clip you're watching, I didn't realize I was the boss's fixation target. I was too focused on healing my group after they got yoinked in, and I got punched in the mouth for it. The last bomb was unfortunately too far away from the boss to make him walk into it, so I walked into it instead. The reason I did this was because if the bomb timer goes off, it usually one-shots the group depending on the key level and the affix, meaning tyrannical. Before the last bomb of the fight, I did take another cleaver to the dome while kiting the boss into it. This was because I didn't plan my route well enough, but it all worked out as Dractyr domes seem to be sturdier than most. Immediately after the first boss is the first time you encounter Curse Blades, every tank's favorite enemy inside of Siege of Borealis. They apply a curse debuff that increases your damage taken. This only affects the tank, so you don't have to worry about the group, but it does mean you should either decurse the tank if you have a decurse available, send an external on the tank, or just spot heal the crap out of them. Obviously, in a +7 Tyrannical with a really good blood DK, this isn't a big deal, but in higher keys or with less efficient tanks, you definitely want to pay attention to it. On top of the Curse Blades, there are also the Shredders. This isn't the first time we're encountering Shredders, but they do put a very nasty bleed on your tank that can get out of hand if the tank isn't ready for it, so plan your healing accordingly between this and the Curse Blades. The rest of the group is really only threatened by the commander enemy that has to be kicked to prevent buffing the enemies, and also charges a random player, doing moderate damage and applying a beefy dot to anyone in the circle indicator. It's worth externaling a squishy for this, especially if you know they won't or can't use a defensive. In the murder hallway, our mage confidently followed the hunter who ran through it with his immunity up. This went as well as you could expect. An interesting note for the spotter circles: you only have to move every other circle. The time before the first circle lands is long enough to allow you to save space that way. I reflex moved out of the first circle, but the next two I dropped on top of each other. Depending on your luck, the spotter can just die while running around, or it can do what it did to us and run into a pack of Curse Blades. If your decurse is a long cooldown, in other words, if you're a preservation evoker, just save it. I derped out and decursed our tank here when there was really no threat to them from these enemies. I was better off saving it in case they needed it in the next group we pull. In that pull, the tank was sitting at 3 stacks of the debuff, and my decurse was on cooldown. If the commander charge had gone on them, that could have been pretty rough, especially had it been fortified or a 10 or higher key where it's always fortified. The pull before the second boss can get pretty messy pretty quick. There's a lot of area denial between the cannoneer, the commander charge, and the spotter. On top of that, the spotter has a habit of running into the boss and pulling it. As a healer, keep your focus on avoiding the crap and healing whoever is being charged by the commander, while sparing a thought for your tank in case they're debuffed by the Curse Blades. For some reason, the Curse Blades are not linked to the other enemies, and you can avoid pulling them entirely if you choose so, but more often than not, they'll get AoE'd and join the meat grinder. In this run, the spotter ended up going towards the boss and pulling it because both of the spotters in this run just hate us, which brings us to the boss fight. The only real damage event worth noting as a healer is the Fiery Ricochet. This will almost always hit 4 players for moderate damage up front and a very nasty, quickly ticking dot. It's important to be ready for the damage. The circles that the boss puts out are identical to the spotter ones. You can wait for the second circle to be placed before moving out and placing another 2. One thing to note is that if you're in melee range, make sure you leave room for the tank to stay in melee range of the boss. This is important because if the tank leaves melee range, the boss begins to deal damage to other players instead, which can lead to deaths. And that's it for this boss. Rinse and repeat. The intermission with the adds is fairly straightforward. Kill the cannoneer, pick up the gun, and shoot it. You don't have to aim it at the boss at all. You can just shoot it in any direction. This isn't the case with the cannons on the last boss, so keep that in mind. The trash packs after this boss include the Demolisher Addons. Their AoE slam is a significant damage event, and on high enough keys you will either have to line of sight it or use a defensive. That being said, it's important to prep healing for it. If you have a short cooldown disease dispel, using it here can save lives, as it will prevent players from ticking down and being low HP when the slam comes in. This is the #1 cause of deaths in these pulls. Another thing that can cause deaths is the silence that the Tempest enemies cast. If it's being cast at the healer, it is a priority interrupt. In the last pack, there is also an enemy that puts a different type of disease on the tank, which reduces their healing taken. This disease should probably take priority over the dot if your tank is having trouble living. Otherwise, continue dispelling the dot to keep your DPS safe. After the monkeys and bananas come the first encounter of sniper enemies in the dungeon. These little shits can be a real pain in the ass. Ideally, your tank will turn all of them away from the group, and your group will stay behind all of them. This way, only the tank will be shot at, and it'll be trivially easy to deal with them. They do sometimes bug out and shoot players that are clearly behind them, but for the most part, this tactic does work. However, our group decided to focus the spotter, which is conveniently located just a bit behind the snipers, which means any melee DPS hitting the spotter will also be targeted by the snipers. Your best bet as a healer here is to crank the HPS and send CC as best you can, especially if you see that the snipers are all shooting at the same target, as that's often a death right there. The trash right around the giant boss has a new enemy, the Invader. It puts a stacking poison dot and slow on the tank. If you can, dispel it at 4 to 5 stacks. Other than that, the only noteworthy thing about the trash is that there is a skippable pack on the far side of the room as you enter. If you skip it, be sure to not get too close to those enemies when you're hiding from the boss waves. The boss fight itself is incredibly boring for a healer. The only damage event is the Breakwater cast, which if it doesn't one-shot your players, is easily healable before the next one comes in, unless your group stands in puddles, it leaves, or the trash pack we talked about gets pulled, which is what happened to us. They wiped most of us out pretty quickly, because there's snipers in that pool. Luckily, our Blood DK is an absolute unit and soloed the last 34 million health on the boss. I tried to help him as soon as the boss was dead, but it was too little too late, as the tank was already running on fumes at that point and went down before I could save him. I didn't want to commit any long cooldowns because I was scared of the last boss. Speaking of which, it is time for Squidward's steroid-addled cousin to send us to the Shadow Realm a few times. I died like an idiot on the way down to the boss, and the tank pulled as I was still running back to the fight. This meant I had no time to set up any healing, and our mage ate doo-doo. To be fair though, the mage did die with all their defenses up to the slam AoE damage after I cleansed them from the dot. But still, if I had been there from the start, they'd have hots, and my first global may not have been a cleanse. We recovered from that by CRing the mage, but we had more trouble brewing because our warrior who used the first cannon didn't know that you in fact had to shoot Squidward's cousin in the dome. I don't know if I was the first to realize what happened, but I panicked and hovered over to try and shoot the bastard, but this was a mistake because people got the dot and I wasn't there to heal or dispel them. We reset, informed the tank that they need to make sure to stand in melee range of the tentacles, otherwise other players get slapped, and went again. This time around it was much smoother, even with the fact that everyone dipped and left me, the healer, to deal with the cannon. I did manage to get back to them in time to cleanse the mage from certain death, but I could have done without this little stress test. Speaking of mage and death, our friend stood there and ticked down from full health with the dot just out of range of my breath, not using a single defensive, all of which were available, so by the time I realized I should always be dispelling them first, it was too late. They had eaten the doo-doo yet again. Other than that, we had no real issues for the remainder of the fight. We actually got pretty lucky and started always getting one of the 2 dots onto the tank, which made the mechanic much easier to handle. Almost like Blizzard should have made this the case for the mechanic in general, instead of forcing healers to sweat their eyeballs out while watching players not use a single defensive to help them. With the last cannonball landing on Squidward's cousin's dome, we had timed a +7 Siege of Morales. And yes, I ate shit the second I was forced to evacuate the cannon because the swirlies were landing at the same time. Shit happens. This was our first timed +7 key and the beginning of the end of this challenge. Timing it has definitely boosted my confidence as a preservation evoker, and I'm ready to tackle the rest of this series. Because believe it or not, when I'm not focusing on talking about what I'm doing, I can actually do the thing. Let me know if you enjoyed the first fully voiceovered key in the series. It was a doozy to make. Definitely more demanding time and editing wise than live commentary, but at least you guys don't have to look at me play like a headless chicken for yet another key while calling every other spell thingy thing with the stuffy stuff. But that's pretty much it for this episode. If you enjoyed it, drop a like, let me know what you liked about it in a comment down below. If you had fun, make sure you subscribe because there's more episodes coming. And if you're feeling particularly generous, you can become a channel member by hitting the join button. Channel members have guaranteed replies to their comments, and they get nice little shoutouts at the beginning of episodes. But as always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.